Hey YouTube, Paul James Caden here. I want to take a moment to thank all of you who watched the last video and commented and kind of supported and, agreed with some of the issues that are going on with YouTube lately. I really appreciate that so many of you understand and know what I was talking about and what I was saying in that particular podcast and recording. So with that being said, I decided to upgrade the channel a little bit. I'm going to change the name, if it will allow me to change the name at this time, to the Paul James Caden podcast channel. And I'm going to continue to share episodes of the spirit side here. But I'm also going to share a lot of episodes of my new podcast, which is called The Inner Sanctuary. Now, The Inner Sanctuary is a more spiritual podcast than the spirit side. And it's really designed to be just that, positive, spiritual, a light in the darkness, something positive in the midst of so much negativity. And hence the name, The Inner Sanctuary. The podcast is really meant to help people build their own inner sanctuary within, find inner peace within. And so without further ado, I would like to share the first episode of The Inner Sanctuary here on YouTube. I hope you all enjoy it. Thank you for listening. And just thanks for being good people. You know who you are when I say that. Enjoy the podcast and let me know what you think below. Peace, guys and gals. Blessings one and all, and welcome to the Inner Sanctuary. Formerly known as the Urantia podcast, and as I said in the last episode of the Urantia podcast, I had to change the name due to some copyright reasons. Some folks had asked me to do that because they had a Urantia group and a podcast, and they had copywritten some of their branding. So here we are at the Inner Sanctuary, which I really like that name because the reason I chose it is because I've always been very fascinated with mysticism. And mysticism is just that. It's finding that inner quiet, or the sanctuary, or as some Buddhists and mystics say, the monastery within, that place where you are at peace, you're connected with your own soul, your own thoughts, and even the spark of the divine presence within. And for me, before I really knew what a mystic was, because there were a lot of times in my younger years that you heard the word mystic used a lot. And, you look at it as being someone who is just mystical, whether whether they were a sage or someone who meditated or someone who practiced magic or seances or connecting with the spirit world. It was kind of the blanket statement, mystic or mystical, but I found out years later, as I got older and really got into my religious and spiritual studies, that a mystic in its true sense is someone who wants that direct personal experience of connecting or experiencing the divine presence in their lives. And a lot of mystics, even though they might belong to certain religions, whether it be Islam or Christianity or something else, they certainly go beyond the parameters and the dogmas and the doctrines of those religions to seek that experience, to seek that connection. And there's a lot of people in religious institutions who might, they may be Christians, who look at the Christian mystics and say, well, they're heretics. This is not Christianity. There are certainly those in Islam who look at the Sufi and say, well, they're not really Islamic. They're not following the traditional ways, because mysticism doesn't. It colors outside of the lines to make that personal connection and have that personal experience with God in their lives, and also within, in that inner sanctuary. And, that was something that I always did my entire life, and I didn't even know that that's what mysticism was. I've just always really would seek the divine presence around me and within me, and just want to experience it, experience the truth, rather than what somebody told me the truth was, or told me about the divine. I wanted to experience the divine for myself, even if it was touching the hem of the garment to get a little bit of understanding of what this being we call God truly is. Is it personal? Is it real? Is it kind and loving? Is it judgmental? Is it, something completely different than what we perceive it as being? And so that's always been my quest. And I say that not to make this a podcast on mysticism, but to kind of go off in the direction that the mystics often say, to seek the divine, to seek the experience of the divine, or seek the divine within in the silence. It's following the way of the heart. And that's what I want to talk about in this podcast, is following the way of the heart, or following your heart. Because all of us who are spiritual often have these ideas, some of us from a pretty young age, that there's something greater out there that we want to experience, we want to connect with. And we might have our ways, we might have our thoughts, we might experiment a little bit as we get older and have a little bit more of an understanding of this concept of spirituality and God and religion. But then generally what happens is we get introduced to an organized religion or a religious institute, and they often tell us that this is wrong. We can't seek the presence of God. We can't seek the divine experience without their guidance, because we're often we will do something that is blasphemous. We will go in the wrong direction. We may contact entities that are evil and dark, disguising themselves somehow as an angel or divinity. And so we usually shut the door on all of that and say, oh, geez, I don't want to do that. So we close that part of ourselves off. And then we are no longer the seeker. We are no longer seeking the divine presence. We are no longer seeking an experience with the divine, but rather we're being led or told. We become now the follower, and we're following someone else's ideas or doctrines or thoughts or philosophies on the concept of the divine. But for all of us, there remains that curiosity, because you probably noticed, and maybe you're one of these people yourself, that there are individuals that belong to different churches or religious, denominations or organizations, but they themselves color outside the lines. You'll hear them say, well, yeah, I'm a Catholic, but I meditate, I practice the Zen lifestyle, or they meditate and read the tarot. They meditate and try to connect with God, Jesus, angels, saints. And this is the way of the mystic. I believe that we all have that innate desire in our souls because that is what we are born to do, to seek. But I would certainly like to clarify that when we are seeking, we do have to be careful that our seeking doesn't become a quest to find validation for something that we want to believe or do that is not necessarily right. Because you'll see people who will harm others or, sadly kill other human beings in the name of God. And they'll say some such thing, well, my religion taught me this, or I heard the voice of God, or an angel told me this person was evil and they had to die, or that I had to do this, heinous thing, or steal, or harm someone, or something in some way. Now that generally is, again, seeking validation to do something wrong that we know we shouldn't do. Because when it comes to the way of the heart or seeking that divine experience, one of the first things you notice, and it's one of the first things I've noticed before I was ever introduced to religion as, a child, one of the first things that I noticed is that presence really is love. See, we often look at religion and we kind of poo-poo it, how terrible it is, the awful things that it's done. And yeah, there's definitely some things that are wanting when it comes to religion and the actions of religious leaders. Absolutely. But there's also things in a lot of those religions and all religions that point in the right direction. And those are the things that the Christian mystic can go into the Christian scriptures and find and experience that higher thought and say, wow, there's something greater than all of this, greater than what I've been taught and told. This is why the Sufi can go to the Quran and find these very peaceful, very loving, very gentle verses and say, aha, this is what God is. And all that violence, all of that division and hatred and holy wars and all of these sort of things become non-existent to the mystic, because the one who's following the way of the heart then begins to look at these holy books and say, oh, these acts of violence, these verses that talk about turmoil and war, they're not literal, but they're states of consciousness, they're states of being that take place within myself, within my own mind, within my own heart, within my own soul. And some people may say, well, that is an incorrect way to interpret the scripture. But I would say to that, there's something in the mystical path, there's something in the way of the heart that makes one reinterpret things in that way. Because they know in the very depths of their being that this being that we call God or the divine is above all of that. It's beyond hatred and killing and fighting over land, labeling a piece of land holy land and killing and, just hating one another because of a strip of land. The mystic begins to realize that this being we call God is so far above all of that. that he, she, it, call it what you will, it is love, it is peace, it is joy, it is sheer bliss. And there's absolutely no mystic from any tradition, from any religious tradition stretching back far into the history of the past that will ever tell you that God is violent, hateful, supportive of war, hurting others, killing others, doing bad things to others, rejecting others because of their religion. And that's one of the interesting things about the Sufi, is that they say it doesn't matter what you call God. Call him Allah, call him Christ, call him Jesus, call him Buddha, call him whatever name you want to hang on the divine. The important thing is that you're acknowledging God. And whatever you call him, he responds. So the Sufi respect all religious paths and see them all as equal. So we can look at the history of mysticism and see that all of the great mystics agree that God certainly is love beyond what we can perceive and define. So if you're following the way of the heart and you're feeling inspired or like there's someone out there or up there giving you validation that it's okay to harm or hurt or hate another individual, then you're not actually following the way of the heart. You're following the way of what the Bible calls the carnal mind, the natural mind. The mind of natural man that seeks its own way and will hurt and kill and steal and destroy and go to war and do whatever it must to get its way or get what it wants. And that is not the way of the heart. Because the way of the heart is generous, it is kind, it gives, it doesn't take. I was reading the account of a great Buddhist saint and mystic last night that talked about he was so generous, no matter what anybody asked him for, he would give it away. He was a man who had a lot of riches, and he gave a lot of his money to the poor. But people would ask him, can I have this? Can I have that amount? Can I have this much gold? And he would just give it until he had nothing. And then eventually he ended up leaving his hometown. He left with his wife, his children, a horse and a buggy, a horse and a carriage. And someone came along and asked for the 2 horses, and he said, you may have them. Then somebody else came along and said, can I have your carriage? And he gladly gave the carriage. And it even came down to where the gods noticed his generosity and disguised themselves as men and asked for his wife and his children. And he gladly gave them up. But then the gods restored all things to him because he was such a generous soul. So the way of the heart is giving. It doesn't necessarily mean, giving all your money or your possessions or your home to somebody that asks for it. Most of us don't have that kind of wealth that we could do that kind of thing. But if someone is hungry, cold, alone, nowhere to go, we can offer them food, a place to stay, a warm bed to sleep in, somewhere to be until they get on their feet again. So the way of the heart is never, ever selfish. It is never hateful. And this is often why you find people who are following the way of the heart, seeking that divine presence, that they're such loving and peaceful and kind people. And as I said in one of my podcasts past, these are the kind of people we all meet in life. And when we depart from their company, we say, wow, that person had something that I wish I had. Because they're such
a peace about them and a glow about their countenance and a twinkle in their eye, and we want that. And we can all achieve that by following the way of the heart in love. But I want to say something else about the way of the heart in this podcast. And that is, it's something that we don't necessarily feel comfortable following, because we are told, and I did in my other podcast, The Spirit Side, I talked about this in one of the episodes, where we are told in religion, like I come from the evangelical fundamentalist Christian background, and there was always that particular proverb that was used that says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to death. And so we're always taught you can't trust your own thoughts. You can't trust your own feelings. You can't trust your own intuitions, because often this is how the bad spirits influence us, and they may even disguise themselves as an angel of light to lead you astray. And so following your heart or being an independent thinker is one of the worst things that you can do spiritually, because it may end you up in serious blasphemy, heresy, leading you down a dark path that progressively gets darker, and of course, makes you very displeasing to God, and you end up in a very bad place when you leave this world. So they tell us, in order to be spiritually safe and sound and pleasing to the man upstairs, do what we tell you to do. Follow our religious laws and doctrines, and, you'll be okay. But yet those doctrines, and yet those laws, and yet those teachings that are supposed to make us okay are often littered with the ideas and teachings of human beings. They will teach us to hate those of a different religion, judge those who don't believe as we do, even kill those who don't believe as we do. Make sure that you vote for the right candidate in a political election so our religious rights are protected. But make sure that that political candidate believes what we believe, so that he will take away the rights of those other religious people. Because what they believe is evil. It's leading people astray. So the books should be censored. The religion should be censored. It should be even outlawed. So it starts to get very murky when we follow these precepts and doctrines of men, because there's just that. There's a lot of ideas and prejudices of man in those belief systems. And that might be uncomfortable for some of us to think about or face, but it is absolutely true if we think about it. And that being said, I would ask the question, why can't we follow our own heart? Why can't we set a course and realize that, as we talked about previously, that God, the divine, is good, is love, is kind, is merciful, is giving, is healing. And that if we see ourselves on our spiritual quest going down a road or accepting a religious or spiritual thought, and it starts to turn darker and darker as we head down the pathway, we have to have the common sense to turn around and go back the other way. Because all of us, as seekers, we can hit dead ends. We can come across things that sound good on the surface, but then once we start to explore, it can start turning dark and filled with those precepts of men once again. But this is where we stop being blind followers, because so many of us are looking for a leader. Even in religion, we want somebody to tell us how to believe, how to seek, how to experience. And so it's very easy for a teaching to sound good, but then if it starts kind of getting sour or dark or heavy over time, we might feel uncomfortable, but we go with it because initially we like the teaching. Well, I guess the person knows what they're talking about, so I'm just going to keep following. And before we know it, we're in a spot we wish we weren't, or, it really kind of derails our spiritual seeking for a period of time. Because sometimes it takes time to recover from something like that for a lot of folks. So we have to use common sense. If we see these dark, hateful, divisive, dividing, philosophies and doctrines and thoughts coming toward us, that we immediately reject them and say, no, I'm not going to bother with that. Because it's okay to explore as a mystic, as a seeker, as one who follows the way of the heart. But again, you have to use common sense. You have to go with that sure foundation that always goes with you, and that is the divine spirit. God is love, is peace, is kindness, is so far above our human perceptions and ways of being. And if we see people telling us it's okay to hurt others, use black magic to hurt others, to persecute others, to hate others, to judge others, that's something that we back away from. We always stick to that sure foundation. If there's one foundational doctrine that we always take with us and always stand on and always refer back to, it is that God is love. And love is peaceable, it is kind, it is accepting, it is compassionate. It is all things good that you could attach to that word, love. And the important thing for you as the seeker, the one following the way of the heart, isn't necessarily going out there and traveling, going to this teaching and this philosophy and this idea, like a ping pong ball kind of being batted back and forth on the table. Your main objective is to experience God in your life. And you do that through meditation, seeking God in the silence, meditating and focusing on the divine presence within yourself or around you. You do this by contemplation. Contemplation is contemplating God, either in meditation with eyes closed or with eyes open, whether you're reading a holy book or a very beautiful poem, or looking at nature, or looking at your pet cat or your dog and just the love you have for that animal, and just contemplating the presence of God and the wonder of God in that animal, in you, and the love and the connection that you share, and what it says to you about the divine being and the divine presence. So meditation and contemplation, these are very personal things in following the way of the heart. But that is your greatest goal, is to experience that presence. To experience God and the joy and the bliss and the love and the happiness that it makes you feel. Because once you do have that experience where you even touch that hem of the holy garment, that's when your life changes. And you may not experience it every time in your meditations and contemplations. Sometimes you experience a lot. Sometimes you experience it and it's a while before you experience it again. But you're constantly the seeker. As mystics say, you are the lover seeking the presence of the beloved. And you're not necessarily doing that by running all over the creation, looking for the next big teaching or great teacher or philosophy or book. I mean, there's nothing wrong with listening to those things. But we can't be like some people who are obsessed with it. Oh, do you listen to so-and-so? Oh, do you know so-and-so? Have you ever heard so-and-so? People are looking for gurus, on humans in the earth to teach them and show them. The way of the heart isn't seeking the presence of a guru or a teacher. They're seeking direct experience and encounter with the divine presence. And just the joy and the bliss and the wonder that brings. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, it truly does bring all of those things into your life. So don't be afraid to follow the way of the heart. Don't be afraid to follow your heart. Because if you're going forward with this, with that firm foundation, God is love, you're not going to be led off into scary, dark, judgmental, creepy doctrines and religions and philosophies. And why not take that as your foundation and follow the way of the heart? Because isn't it just as good or maybe better than following someone else's heart or someone else's thoughts who's telling you that this is the way that you must seek and believe and be pleasing to this greater being we call God? I would venture to say that when we follow the way of the heart and we do it properly, there's a great sense of peace and freedom and just a feeling of, I knew it all along. This is how it really is when we do experience that divine presence. It's a feeling that's like coming home. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. And I thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to listen. I'm Paul James Caden, and I'll see you next time here in the Inner Sanctuary. Until then, keep following the way of the heart and keep building your own personal inner sanctuary, because it truly is the building made without human hands. Blessings one and all. I'll see you next time.